Nerdrotic.com.
Welcome back to Nerdrotic. My name is Gary Beekler, and I come to you from Nerdrotic.com. And we need to talk about Game of Thrones and Star Wars. Did Star Wars interfere with Game of Thrones Season 8? Many of us have suspected this, but I think I have a little circumstantial evidence. I have been sitting on an article for about a month, and thanks to Lord Athar for reminding me of this. I believe Star Wars did interfere with Game of Thrones because Dan and Dave had one foot out the door. And now that we've seen Season 8 and seen the documentary and seen the lack of Dan and Dave in the documentary, we also had George Lucas showing up on set during the filming of the first episode. Why? Why was George Lucas on the set of Game of Thrones? Maybe a Star Wars connection? Maybe they were multitasking and doing a meeting while they were producing the show? Well, that's not putting your full attention on the show. That is having one foot out the door, in my opinion. And for those of you who had high hopes for the D&D Star Wars, allow me to shatter them and then ground them into a fine powder. They are working closely with Rian Johnson. Let's go to the articles. From the pinnacle of journalism that is Screen Rant, Star Wars, Rian Johnson working with Benioff and Weiss on new movies. Rian Johnson and David Benioff and D.B. Weiss are working closely together as they plot the course for their respective Star Wars movie projects. This December, Lucasfilm will release The Rise of Skywalker, the ninth and final episode in the classic Skywalker saga that defined the franchise since 1977. However, that will hardly be the last Star Wars film to grace the big screen. Well, I wouldn't be too sure about that. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. The studios already announced plans for separate series spearheaded by Johnson and Benioff and Weiss, both of which are said to be disconnected from the generation-spanning Skywalker story. Wow, that's great news. We learned that there's going to be no lightsabers. We're ending the Jedi. We're ending the Sith. So basically, we're going to get a label. We're going to get some letters that we recognize. Star Wars. That's about what we're going to get. And people holding out for the Knights of the Old Republic and being adapted by Dan and Dave, well, unless any of those books were written by George R.R. Martin, I wouldn't hold out any hopes. Of course, details about the films are hard to come by other than speculation. Benioff and Weiss's series will be set up during the Old Republic era. It will likely be some time before anything's officially announced. And maybe that's going to get delayed even more considering the reception of Game of Thrones Season 8. It will likely be some time before anything officially is announced, but the various parties are hard at work behind the scenes, figuring out where they want these new narratives to go. And even though the projects are presumably independent of one another, Johnson is working alongside the Game of Thrones showrunners during these earliest days of development. Now, it will make sense to many that they work together. Of course, they want to coordinate these things. But the fact that they're working together is disastrous for Star Wars fans who deserve so much better than they have received from Kathleen Kennedy, Jar Jar Abrams, and, of course, Rian Johnson. The Last Jedi is not anything I have talked about a lot on this channel because the movie literally gave me a headache. It was one of the worst films I've ever seen. I want to forget every second I observed from that film. Luke Skywalker drinking from a manatee titty will forever be seared in my mind, unfortunately, and that is thanks to Rian Johnson and subverted expectations, and we just got a healthy dose of subverted expectations with Game of Thrones. Now, there are spectacle episodes that I did love throughout the last few seasons of Game of Thrones, and season 6 was okay, but it's never been the same since season 4, since they got off the books. Now, I fully believe that they're going to stick with Dan and Dave. They are just going to look at the bottom line. If you look at the bottom line for Game of Thrones, it was a massive success, highest ratings ever. If you completely ignore the fans, which they do all the time, so that's no problem, but they are also going to have to ignore the access media, who seems to hate it along with the fans. It's a rare moment. It's a singularity in fandom, but that will not stop Disney because that bottom line rules all. Now, we have to take into consideration they've only announced one trilogy. So we have two guys, Dan and Dave, known for writing, well, kind of, and then we have another guy kind of known for directing. It's like, imagine this was the 90s and Yui Boll and Michael Bay were working on a Star Wars film together. There would be backlash, there would be outrage. But to be honest with you, I would rather have Yui Boll and Michael Bay planning Star Wars than Rian Johnson and Dan and Dave. Mix in Jar Jar Abrams and Kathleen Kennedy, and you almost have all of the heads of the multi-headed Hydra of the franchise apocalypse together on one project. What the hell? Call Alex Kurtzman. Call Chris Chibnall. We're missing a couple of people. Where's Stephen Moffat on this? Let's throw him in there too. Once David Lindelof is done ruining The Watchmen, we could probably call him as well and reunite him with Jar Jar. And what the hell, while we're at it, let's cast Sonequa Martin Green and Brie Larson. Let's burn this MFer down. In an interview with EW at Celebration Chicago, which I unfortunately missed, Lucasfilm president Kathleen Kennedy provided an update on the next state of the Star Wars movies. She revealed that Benioff and Weiss are more or less collaborating with Johnson at this point. I completely missed that. As they finish Game of Thrones, they're going to seg into Star Wars. They're working very closely with Rian, and that explains a lot for Game of Thrones Season 8 around these parts. We've been saying that they had one foot out the door, Dan and Dave, and they weren't really paying attention to Game of Thrones Season 8. They took the fans for granted. They thought they would eat up whatever they gave us. And, well, for the most part, we did. But a lot of us did end up complaining about it. A lot has changed since then. But it certainly looks like Star Wars interfered with Game of Thrones, and Rian Johnson's influence was in there. Kennedy's comments should not be taken to mean that Johnson and Benioff and Weiss series are one in the same, or will be intricately connected. Right now, it's more plausible the three are having conversations simply to see what they all have in mind to screw up Star Wars. And make sure there aren't any blatant similarities between the two projects. Well, if sucking is a blatant similarity, they already have achieved that. It would be a shame if the first installments of each covered nearly identical territory, subverting expectations, since the idea here is to illustrate how vast the Star Wars galaxy is for storytelling possibilities. Well, it seems vast, but it seems like the writers lately, that writer's room that Kathleen Kennedy has, was really working in a very tiny space of the Star Wars galaxy. It's smart for the creative teams to be bouncing ideas off each other, not these three. Particularly since the films will fall under the same canon. Perhaps they could work on organic references to each other's movies if an opportunity presents itself. Well, this article again is from April 16th. And the reason I bring it to you, because it has full context now that Game of Thrones Season 8 has ended. Now we see that they are working together. Now we see that this did interfere with Game of Thrones, in my opinion. I saw the documentary and I didn't see a lot of Dan and Dave. I saw them at the table reading, and they showed up for the episode they were supposed to direct, and they made a makeup lady nervous. That was about it. But they are working very closely with Rian Johnson to destroy the Star Wars universe. And now we hear there will be no Jedi, no Sith, no lightsabers. Sounds like they've been talking to Jar Jar. The $1 million question, of course, is when fans will see these films come into fruition. Smartly, Star Wars is taking a break on the movie side of things following the rise of Skywalker as Lucasfilm coordinates a slate for their next phase. Not only is it a good idea to take as much time as needed to figure everything out, it'll also help combat any feelings of franchise fatigue by starving the marketplace of new movies. Oh, well, you also run the risk of people just not giving a crap anymore. Apathy is the worst enemy of any franchise. In the interim, the studio will be banking on Disney Plus series such as The Mandalorian to fill the void. But in a few years, they'll be unveiling a big comeback plan for Star Wars on film. Star Wars fans, I am sorry to report this is not your new hope, and you deserve so much better. You have been so loyal and so passionate for so long, and Kennedy just doesn't get it. Never has, never will. As long as she's in charge, Star Wars will never work at Disney. Bob Iger needs to recognize this someday. And if he is just afraid to fire a woman executive, you are risking your billion-dollar franchise. Game of Thrones fans, this to me is confirmation that Star Wars did interfere with Game of Thrones Season 8. It might have even had something to do with the delay. Now, of course, we will hear denials, but it just sounds like they've been working on this project for a while now while they were making Game of Thrones Season 8, not giving it its full attention, and it certainly showed. Everybody, have a great day. If you like what you heard, please like, share, and subscribe. It really does help this channel. Welcome to all the new subscribers, and may the free folks sing songs of your greatness.